Hello. Hi. All right. I'm Michael Hughes. I am an instructional librarian and associate professor from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. This is my first MAGFest. It's been as lovely as I've been led to believe, so I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to be here talking with you about video game fanzines. Um, you're here, which means you've probably forgiven me the use of this terrible pun. Thank you for that. But there's the purpose behind that, and we'll get to it shortly. But before we do, I have some acknowledgments to make. I want to thank first Chris Kohler for creating a fanzine and then having the foresight to keep all of not only his fanzines but all the zines that were sent to him, and then for making a very generous donation to the Strong Museum so that we can study and learn from those. That means I also need to thank my colleagues from the Strong for everything that they do. I was very fortunate to spend the summer, 2 weeks over the summer at the Strong on fellowship, standing over a table, taking pictures of these over and over again on my smartphone in the freezing, freezing cold. So if you ever work at the Strong, bring a parka. Thank you, Phil Salvador, everyone at Mages for having me. I'm so grateful. And I also want to thank all fan editors, past and present, for sharing your insights with me, your knowledge. Big thanks also to Jeff Bogomil, the author of a zine called Concordant Opposition, and a guru over at retromags.com. He's been so generous in his information and insight. So, yeah, paper, please. What am I about with that title? Well, I think one easy way to think about that, or maybe a good way to think about it, is to look at this zine here. So this is not a video game fanzine, but it's a long-running zine called The East Village Hinky. It details a mother's life in the East Village, New York. This is still going. This was first published in 1998. This issue, however, is from July 2018. If you look at the bottom there, you'll see this this big, all caps, print is not dead, right? Which is kind of a nod to this 1981 album by the Scottish punk band The Exploited. So print is not dead, and I think that's very important because this talk is as much about the history of fanzines as it is about their future. Okay. Another alternate title was supplied to me at the last minute by Frank Cifaldi, who did kind of a one-and-done fanzine in order to present at the Classic Games Expo. And I was talking with him about this, and he said, well, I didn't know what I was doing, but that's okay. And I couldn't agree more. As a one-sentence summary of the ethos of zines, of what it is to actually make these things, I think that's really beautiful because it really gets to the heart of the DIY mentality that comes out of the punk scene. You should do it yourself. You should do it because you love this stuff. The zines that we're going to be talking about today are amateur efforts, but I mean that in the best possible sense. I want to return that meaning to its root, which meant, to love or one who loves, right? So that's really what we're talking about. Whenever I use the word amateur here, I want us to forget about its pejorative connotation, okay? So I think it's really important for us to begin with a kind of definition, right? So we should, at least for the purposes of this talk, we should have an understanding about what a fanzine is, right? Does anyone want to supply a definition? Does anyone want to take a stab at this? Yeah. Do you want to do it again? Yeah, a magazine made by fans for fans. Anyone else want to append anything to that? I think that's great. Say again, one more time. Usually limited run, small circulation. Absolutely, right? So these are amateur publications. They're decidedly non-professional, non-commercial. So done for love rather than money. And they are printed in low numbers, and that means there's a very, very low circulation. These tend to be quite intimately read. So the emphasis here is really on personal expression, right? These publications are extensions of their creators, of their editors, rather than publications which aspire to some kind of professional standard, right? And as we might see, there are some fanzines that even hold that in contempt, right? Like, oh, you're trying to be a professional magazine, there's no sin greater than trying to make money. But as we'll see, so pinning down a definition is kind of tough, but it's important to sort of begin with this shared understanding. So where do these things come from, right? Where do zines begin? Zines have their origin in the science fiction community, right? So this is the 1926 issue of Amazing Stories, Hugo Gernsback's science fiction magazine. So this is not necessarily the beginning of science fiction, but it is the magazine that gives us science fiction as we understand it today. It's the first periodical that is completely devoted to science fiction, right? It's also the birthplace of zines, because Gernsback does this interesting thing, right? He wants readers to talk to him about the magazine, about the stories in the magazine, and he takes those letters and he publishes them. But he goes one step further and he publishes the address of the people who wrote in. And so fans are seeing, oh, there's someone like me over here in Missouri, and I'm in New Jersey, and now I can write to this person, and we can continue to talk like outside of the magazine about our interests, right? So this is 1926. Only 4 years later, we get the Comet. The Comet is recognized as the very first fanzine. This is 1930. It's published by the Science Correspondence Club in Chicago, and it was edited by Raymond A. Palmer and Walter Dennis. Raymond A. Palmer is an important name to know because he would later go on to become an editor of Amazing Stories. Here's some other trivia for you. In the Comet's wake, there came a zine called The Time Traveler. The Time Traveler had a young Jerry Siegel as one of its subscribers. You might recognize that name because he's one of the co-creators of Superman. And in fact, it was The Time Traveler in which Superman first appeared. So if we sort of flash forward 2 decades, what we have is a thriving fan culture. Okay, so at this point, fandom, fanzines, they are a cultural phenomenon, and they have risen to enough prominence, enough influence to have their own column in Amazing Stories. So these things are now being read by, in this case, Rog Phillips, who is a science fiction author himself. So he's reading these things, he's reviewing them, and he's doing the thing that Gernsback had started himself, right? He's publishing not only reviews of zines, but he's publishing the addresses of the people who create them and putting them in contact to one another. So flash forward a little bit further, it's now 1963, and this guy right here is an avid reader of the Clubhouse in particular. So he's a science fiction fan, but he loves the Clubhouse above all. Anyone know who this is? All right, so this is Arnie Katz. This is one of the co-founders of video game journalism as we know it. He's pictured here with the 2 other co-founders that are recognized. On the left is Bill Kunkel, also known as the Game Doctor. On the right, you've got Arnie Katz's wife, Joyce Worley Katz. And in the back, you have 2 of the young fan editors that Katz inspired. That is a teenage Chris Kohler in the middle, and then on the right is a gentleman named Al Riccitelli, who created a zine called The Dark Side. So more on the fanzines in just a moment. But talking of Katz, he read all of these Clubhouse columns in digest form. He was reading these like cheapy dime reprints of Amazing Stories and included all these Clubhouse columns, and he was totally fascinated by that. So he's thinking, why can't I do this, right? Even though he's reading them years later. So he's like writing to people who've moved and so forth. So after a couple aborted attempts, he finally manages to start connecting with fandom, writing letters, and he becomes something of a BNF, also known as a big name fan, because he's like big in these letter columns. You can search the Internet Archive for Arnie Katz and just see him like popping up here and there and all over the place because he's just talking to other people about this stuff, right? Which is a prelude to his own work in fandom. So with a childhood friend named Lenny Bayliss, Katz begins creating his own science fiction fanzines. I say science fiction fanzines, that's only kind of right. What he created was sort of like a meta fanzine that reports on the doings and happenings within fandom. So this is like the rabbit hole. That's what Quip is. I'm sorry for the super low resolution quality of those pictures. That's the best I could scrape off the internet. But he begins writing Quip, and Quip very quickly becomes one of the bigger fanzines in the science fiction culture. So 1978, Katz has become a professional freelancer. He's making a living off of his writing, and with his colleague Bill Kunkel, begins to create this column called Arcade Alley. This runs in a magazine called Video. This is the dawn of video game journalism right here, right? This is a couple of years before there would be a magazine dedicated to this stuff. But he approaches his editor and says, look, These games are really taking off. Somebody ought to be reporting on them. I think I can do that. I like this stuff a lot. And his editor gives him his blessing to move forward. Um, One of the casualties of his new work in games, however, is his fan activity, which has to subside. He no longer has the time to do that. So his fan activity kind of takes a dip as his career in video game journalism begins to take off. So we have Arcade Alley in 1978. By 1981, we have the first magazine dedicated to electronic games, called Electronic Games. This is a very condensed history of video game journalism. Um, he continues on to a magazine called Video Games and Computer Entertainment after Electronic Games folds. And then by February 1990, we get this inciting, incipient moment for video game fanzines. So Katz has this column in Video Games and Computer Entertainment called Inside Gaming. And this is where he just sort of takes on an issue or a development in game culture or game industry at the time. Like he might report on the emergence of optical media, for example, talk about what that means for games. But he uses one of those columns to talk about why gaming doesn't have a better reputation, why it isn't talked about in the same terms as other major kinds of culture, like movies and music and so forth. And his answer to that is basically like, we gamers, we fans and players should take a more active role in advocating for our hobby. We need to make people understand why this matters. And he comes up with a variety of solutions, but he returns to the one that he understands best, which is to create fanzines. We should create our own media about this and kind of tell people why we love it. So he writes this column. He ends it this way. There's this rallying cry. He tells people, create fanzines, send them to me. I'm going to become kind of like your distributor. I'm going to let people know about this stuff. Act now. Fandom is waiting to hear from you. So with this single column, Arnie Katz becomes not only the father of video game journalism, but the father of video game fandom. Right? Maybe. Kind of. The answer is yes and no. So let's talk a little bit about that. To get to the bottom of that, we basically have to return to this question that we started with. What is a fanzine, right? So there is this interesting question of taxonomy that we have to address. Because for sure, there are these other like weird emergent publications that come as gaming begins to really take off, and especially as it begins to enter the home. Right. So we have things like the Video Game Update, which later became the Computer Entertainer, and we have things like Arcade Express, which was actually written by Katz, Kunkel, and Worley. By the way, I don't know if you can see this, but I love it. The Video Game Update is subtitled "A Critical Newsletter for the Serious Gamesman." I feel like I have to wear a tie to be the like serious gamesman. Yeah. So we have some newsletters like this, and you know they look a little crude, they look a little rough. And for sure, they're early, right? Like this is July 1982 on the left. So this is a good 8 years before Katz would begin encouraging people to create their own media. So although I think these are cousins to fanzines in a sense, we have to distinguish them from fanzines because of their purpose, right? So the purpose of these things is really true to their name. These are newsletters. The idea of these is really just to tell consumers which games are coming out from which publishers and which games are particularly noteworthy. And so they're really more precursor to games journalism as we know it than fanzine. Yeah. That is a great question. So the one on the left has a really interesting point of distribution or point of origin. This was created by a video store in North Hollywood called Video Takeout. So they were selling video equipment, video supplies, and magnetic media and so forth. There actually is a little interview with their general manager in like a 1982 issue of Billboard. And she says, yeah, games are really taking off for us. Even though we all thought they were dead in the water, we kind of stuck by them. They just seemed like a natural extension of like video media, which is really interesting. Did you? Oh man, good. So can I come to that at the end? So our question is about how did fans manage or stay within the bounds of copyright? That is a really good question. So we'll come to that at the end. Um, yeah. So in the case of Video Game Update on the left, at least, it was like this store that was working in one market and trying to get into another. Um, so that's what's happening over on the West Coast primarily, especially Video Game Update. On the East Coast, we have something that's a little closer to the definition we started with, fanzine. Um, this is the Joystick Jolter. This is the only issue that I could find. I know of exactly one copy in existence, and I was very, very fortunate to sweet talk someone into going to his basement, digging it out, and taking pictures with his smartphone and sending them to me. The Joystick Jolter is a true independent. So this was a newsletter that was written on a typewriter by a gentleman named Anthony Contorno. Contorno was a postal service employee, but a real fan of emerging computer hardware and computer software. This is now the Atari era, you can see, so this is about February, March 1984. And as he tells it, he loved this stuff. His kids loved this stuff, so he bought a copy of Atari Pac-Man, and he brought it home, and they were used to the arcade version, and they loved it. They had a cabinet at their local pizza parlor, and then they brought Atari Pac-Man home, and you can probably guess what happened, right? You're nodding, so what happened? Disappointment is putting it mildly, right? So he's like aghast, right? He's like, children, cover your eyes, it's horrible. But he can't believe that he's had to splash out this tremendous amount of money on a really substandard game. So he goes back to the store and he's like, "You guys didn't warn me," and they're like, "We don't know either." So he's basically like, there is no source of information on games. No one is doing any work to help consumers make educated decisions about the purchases that they want to make. So I'm going to do it. So at this time, it's really important to remember that media is highly regional, right? So he really believed he was the only one out there doing this. So as we've just seen, there are newsletters that predate his, but he wasn't aware of this stuff. And so he just decides to go out on his own again, that do-it-yourself mentality. He makes this newsletter. He advertises it nationally. You can see references to the Joystick Jolter in ads, contemporaneous ads for Atari games. He was featured in an Activision commercial, apparently, which I have not been able to find, unfortunately. But he begins building a list, and his newsletter is distributed nationally, which is kind of amazing. This is a bit of a dogleg, but I really want you to see this. He managed to roll that newsletter up into a television program. He got access to the cable television network of New Jersey, and he has this special in which he goes on, and well, here, let's just watch. I'll let you see. Okay. Oh, you can hear that? So I guess this is hard to hear. I don't know if I'm plugged into the right thing or not, but what he's doing, right, is he's doing a let's play, basically. He's playing these games, or in some cases his kids are playing the games, and he's narrating over them and telling them, this is what you do in the game, and this is what's particularly notable about it. And there's no flicker in this game. Can you believe that? It's incredible. And so he's on there for about an hour doing this for various pieces of software. I think at one point Pitfall 2 shows up, and Millipede, so he's doing all kinds of interesting games. and then giving games away. And anyway, that's Joystick Jolter. So it's an interesting predecessor, but the other one that's really interesting that we have to I talk about is this really weird artifact that I managed to find in the Internet Archive. I don't know if anyone has seen this. Good. Well, you're in the right place. So this is a really fascinating portrait of the emergence of games and home computing into American culture, largely. This is, I guess, it's a kind of fanzine. It's a compilation of news articles and comic strips about video games, and it was circulated in a low print run around 1982. And we were very, very fortunate that this was scanned by Kevin Savitz and uploaded to the Internet Archive. And when I contacted Kevin, he told me that this book was given to him in 2016 by a man named Tony Meadow. Tony Meadow used to work at Atari. And Meadow told Kevin, I don't remember buying it, but on the inside it says it was published by Dr. Storm, whoever that was. And this is the first edition copy number 39. Most of the stuff in here, again, dates from about 1981 to 1982, but unfortunately the source of the book seems to be truly lost. So we have no idea who Dr. Storm is, but what we do know is that Dr. Storm was very interested in games and the way that people were reacting to games and thinking about games as they discovered them for the first time. And so he has this kind of paste up book with stuff that he's just clipped out of newspaper, pasted in, made photocopies, and distributed to his friends. And there's very little evidence of the author in this thing, right? We have this preface, which reads, video games are fascinating, frustrating, and sometimes even fearful. They encroach on our personal lives for better and for worse, and provide a new focus for adult-child relations. They, as we know so well, have created a brave new generation of whiz kids. Sometimes it seems that at any moment they may take over. Some say they already have. So I think this is meant to be read facetiously, it's meant to be humorous, and yet words like fearful, encroach, take over accurately describe some of the alarmist attitudes that you find in the editorials, in the cartoons throughout the booklet, such as this cartoon, de-evolution, yes, or this one, which reads, I know it's great for their hand-eye coordination, it's their brain-reality coordination that concerns me. You also get some evidence of the way that games were already being gendered and made for a certain audience, right? So this is an article from March 3rd, 1980 that is in On Parade, and we have here a note about an asteroids expert named Jim, Jim Thurston, and in this paragraph, fourth paragraph, you have that the popular hangout for teenage boys, recently changed ownership, etc. So some of these attitudes are already beginning to harden or to be circulated by major media. And I couldn't resist putting this in. This is an excerpt from a column by a guy named H. Bruce Miller. It reads, if the Pac-Man craze lasts long enough, it no doubt also will provide grist for the ever-churning mills of academia. One can imagine anthropology seminars discussing Pac-Man and the territorial imperative, or English doctoral theses on Pac-Man and the picaresque tradition. Zing, you've got us all, Bruce Miller. So that's On Parade. I strongly encourage you to go to the Internet Archive right now if you have internet connection and get this. It's amazing. But again, apart from that epigraph, and apart from this interesting cover, which I can only assume is sort of like Pac-Man making his debut, like ta-da, I always hear on Broadway when I see this. So to my mind, at least, also the contents are arranged thematically. So you can see that there is some editorial intention by the way that things are grouped. Like there's a lot of stuff in there about the Cold War, for example. And Space Invaders is a kind of political cartoon for the tensions with Russia. So I think this has a strong claim on being the first fanzine, or at least a kind of quasi-fanzine. But we also know of other predecessors, right? So this is taken from a fanzine called Splat. This is by Eric Longdon. He writes here, my fandom career began about 1989, 1990, when I had friends asking me what games were good out there to buy, what was coming soon, and so on. I decided to make a small magazine with reviews of games I played, a coming soon list, etc. So he calls this NES Master Gamer, and after 6 issues, I ended it. Then we have another one that's sort of like this. This is excerpted from a zine called The Guru by Brian Goss, and he writes, the idea to make a fanzine came upon me, Brian Goss, in 1987 when the first NES debuted the year before. There was no Nintendo Power or any other gaming magazine out for that matter, so with my off-key, non-electric typewriter, I started to type away, and he creates something that he called Vidiotic Maniacs. It was less than impressive, but at least it was something. So the point here is we know that fans were creating their own media, right? Even if they didn't have a name for the thing that they were doing. And they were probably just sharing with their friends, maybe just a family dog, and yet they were taking their enthusiasm for the stuff and setting it down in print in some form, right? And it's really hard, probably impossible to say how often this was happening. Did anyone in here do something like this? Besides me? Yeah?
I used to make my own maze books because I got bored with the like activity ones real quick.
Yeah.
So I would make other mazes and like pass them out to my family to do.
That's awesome.
But something interesting is in the one before this, he notes that he saw the call to the fanzines like in the magazine.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. So
we're like, oh, other people are actually doing this.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you caught that. So we're getting to that next, actually. Yeah. So that brings us back to this cat's rather. His column in that February 1990 issue of Video Games Computer Entertainment, it may not have created video game fandom itself, but it certainly created the most active strain, and the strain that we are now fortunate enough to study because these things have persisted. And he did that by not only writing that inaugural column, kind of urging people to begin creating these things, but he basically reformats the Inside Gaming column to become this, Fandom Central. And the column changes names, he takes it with him to other magazines and so forth. Interestingly, every time he begins this column anew, at like a new magazine, it kind of triggers a new wave of publications, so they're actually discrete generations of these things. And he continues to do the thing that Raj Phillips had done before him. The way that Katz learned his craft and learned sort of the ethic of fandom was through these columns, and he begins to kind of pay it forward. And he does the same thing, not only Raj Phillips, but Robert Bloch, as you may know, is the author of Psycho, among other things. Bloch himself was a BNF, or big name fan. Robert Bloch had done this, so he sort of thinks it's my responsibility to do this for fans. But the interesting thing about the column is he's not just reviewing fanzines, but he's also kind of using the column as a symposium and teaching people how to be fans, right? So these are the things that your fanzine should have. These are the kind of ways you should behave, and this is how you should respond to your readers. So I know this is probably really hard to read in the back, so I'll just read some of them. He says, in number 1, right, print a colophone. If you don't include your name, address, frequency of publication, and a price in an easy to find location, forget about response. And from now on, forget about a review in Fandom Central. Yes, I know. There are too many fanzines to waste space on those who don't provide this necessary information. I like that he includes things as basic as like put text on both sides of the page. But number 4 is super great here. Don't pose. Everyone knows it's a hobby, not a conglomerate. So this is something he returns to again and again, like don't try to make my magazine, be yourself. And the other thing that he does to really help fandom accelerate is he creates this thing called a reader's list, right? So he's not only saying, send me your stuff and I'll review it, so you can find readers that way, but if you want to read this stuff and you want people to read it, send me your name, send me your address. I'm going to collect it all and I'm going to publish it as a readers and publishers list. You can give me a self-addressed stamped envelope, and then boom, you've got a readers list instantaneously. You've got hundreds of names that you can mail your thing out to. When I was talking to Jeff Bogomil about this, he said, it's amazing what a self-addressed stamped envelope can do. And I think that's right, because without this, it would have taken much longer, perhaps it wouldn't have happened at all. This is really like a kind of accelerant that Katz injects into this emerging subculture. So Katz is a kind of doyen of this scene, right? He sort of kind of lords over it. Not self-consciously perhaps, but that's just the position he enjoys. After all, he's sort of taking on himself to review things and pass judgment on them. So that means that fans weren't always necessarily grateful for his work, or they had a kind of contentious relationship with him. This is a cartoon that says, "It came as no surprise to find that Arnie Katz has recently been delegating his fanzine reviewing responsibilities to his pet chimp Stinky." And the pet chimp Stinky there is typing fanzine reviews away. So this is from a fanzine called The Good, the Bad, and the 8-Bit by Brian Pacula. And so you do see this come up again and again as you're reading fanzines. You see this kind of like love-hate tension with Katz. And I'm not entirely sure where that comes from, but I think it probably has something to do with the fact, particularly around 95 to 97, I think fans began to sort of figure out, oh, we are much more enthusiastic about this stuff than Arnie Katz is. I think they had kind of expected to find a fellow traveler, and this is around the time that Arnie Katz is like, I don't really want to do this anymore. The scene has changed, and for various reasons he begins to leave video games. So that might be one source of that tension. So we've talked a lot about fanzines, or at least around them. I think we should look at some, right? Take a look at what's in them. So what's in a fanzine? There are a couple of sort of conventional features that come back and back. Some people will kind of rehash news, although blessedly that you start to see that less and less as people figure out, oh, this is really old. But usually there's a few news items. There are, of course, reviews of other fanzines. There are often editorial pieces or sometimes opinion pieces. They often read more like rants or diatribes. There's humor writing and cartoons, lots of custom illustration. So I'm just going to sort of take you on a whirlwind tour of these things. I could easily fill up an hour just like scrolling through all the PDFs I have. That would be interesting for only me. So I couldn't get away with this presentation without including the Bubster. So here's a review of Bubster. Here's a review of the many deaths of the Bubster. Truly, if any cat had 9 lives. Yeah, this is from a zine called Access Time, published in Austin, Texas, which is just up the road from my home in San Antonio. So I love that this in particular was singled out for comment. This is very interesting to lots of fans. You get all kinds of comics, and some make more sense than others. I've deliberately excerpted this one because I love it. This is from Michael Palisano's The Laser, and what I love about this is that it's sequential art, but I don't know that it doesn't really make sense panel to panel the way that sequential art usually does. These are more like Dadaist comics. They're kind of inscrutable, almost confessional. They seem to be kind of from like a tortured psyche almost. If you notice in the lower right, there's a cameo by Electronic Gaming Monthly. She says that I remind her of Electronic Gaming Monthly, the biggest and the best. So this is again, I know this is going to be kind of hard to read, so let me read a little bit of it for you. This is an excerpt from a fanzine called Monty's Kitten by Brooks King. And it reads at the top, "You can make a difference. Are you getting fed up with EGM? Just sign this letter, guaranteed to be easily understood by a favorite long-haired editor, and send it to Steve Harris. It's that easy." And so you can probably guess where this is going. It's a little unsolicited advice for EGM. Number 2 reads, "Fire the entire writing staff and hire new writers, this time taking care to make sure they have their high school diplomas before hiring them." So I've picked on this one example as a way to talk about a theme that you see, maybe the most immediate theme. If you read 5 fanzines, you can probably count on all 5 having something critical to say about the major games media at the time, right? And I guess that's sort of, maybe that's a given, right? If you're doing a fanzine, you're creating your own media, and we hope that you're sort of creating the media that you want to see in the world. And so one of the things that they can do to create content is sort of look at the magazines they're reading and criticize all the things about them that they don't like. So some of those criticisms are more thoughtful than others, but you see a lot of that in here. You do get some really, really thoughtful pieces though occasionally. I know this isn't much to look at, but it is a fantastic interview by Russ Perry Jr. It appears in a fanzine called Video Game Revolution, and in it, if you can read this top part, they're basically saying, look, we went to CES too, like everyone else, so you're going to get tons of reports about CES. We're not going to do that again because yawn. So instead, Russ Perry interviewed one of their booth babes that he met at CES. He met a woman named Heather Hook who was working at a booth promoting a game called Lester the Unlikely. Does anyone remember Lester the Unlikely? Yes, I knew. Okay, right on. Right. So he meets a woman dressed up as Tika, and she's helping to promote the game. And he basically says, "I just want to talk to you about what you do." And it is a straightforward, sensitive, interesting interview with her about the nature of that business, like how she got into modeling, and what her jobs are like, and whether she's having a good time at CES. It's fascinating. I don't know where else you would read something like that. It's here in Video Game Revolution. Among other things, video game fanzines can be read as a history of desktop publishing too. So as people begin to get their hands on this software and experiment with it, you get all the things that we associate with first-time use of desktop publishing, including fonts. All the fonts. Use all the fonts. So that's really great. And then you get all of this wonderful custom artwork, right? So this is one of the ways that fans could really distinguish themselves. If you were any good at art at all, you became very much in demand, right? By those of us, myself included, who can't draw at all, it's like, please make a cover for my fanzine. So here we have the cover of Video Apocalypse #7. This is by a gentleman named Josh Lesnick from Houston. He was living in Houston at the time. Once again, upper left, got the Bubster. But this is going to be hard to see, but if you can make out the tiny, tiny print on the sleeve, I presume this is Josh, but you can see there's a little bit of print on his lower sleeve there, there's a little print on his upper right sleeve, and there's a little print inside the P, and that reads, "Kill Arnie Katz." So again, hopefully that's not meant to be taken seriously as an imperative, but again, you have this like weird tension with this guy that they simultaneously, like, they loathe and they crave his approval, right? Like please review my zine and love it, love me. Here's another zine cover that I think is really great. And this is Project Ignition by Jess Reagan. And here we've got an Atari Jaguar that's about to meet its grisly end. But what I really love about this is that this copy was hand-colored, right? That seems to be pretty obvious. So presumably, every copy that went out got the same treatment. That's going to be really important for one of parts of my conclusion, right? That there's a trace of the individual at the other side of this thing. So kind of hold that in the back of your mind. Here's a cover that kind of reminds us who these folks were, by and large. They were teenage boys. Not entirely. There are a couple fanzines by women, but by and large, these were the same people that were reading video games and computer entertainment. It's a largely male audience. It's largely teenage or sort of young adult. And so sometimes they are replete with immaturity and humor. So in this case, we've got a drawing of a pimp, and it says, it's signed by the so-called pimp of fandom and bitches. So you do sometimes get what I'll generously call cringy stuff like that. So for every kind of stupid thing like this, you get some really interesting stuff too, right? So as crude as fanzines could be, many are quite intelligent, sophisticated. In this case, we do have kind of an emerging political consciousness. There's an editorial in here about the phenomenon of licensed games. So some early sort of criticism of the marketplace economics, which is interesting. So even very smart zines like this could be a source of what the zine scholar Stephen Duncombe calls high weirdness. This is high weirdness. This is from In Between the Lines #5. So I'm not sure why this blew up the internet, because we've known for 25 years that Sonic lifts. So yeah, so there's funny stuff, there's weird stuff, there's also stuff that can be really tender and quite moving. This is a a letter that the editors of Digital Press, which is surely one of the most, maybe the most important fanzine, right? One of the most widely read and probably the longest running fanzine by Joe Santulli and others. This is a letter they reprinted in their first issue. It's from a woman named Leanne Glenn. She writes, "I'm a 44-year-old wife and mother who has been involved with video games for more than 20 years. I have the original Odyssey system, which I purchased new in the late 60s, and I have virtually every system that has been available since, with extensive software collections for each. My children have grown up playing whatever system was hot at the time, but I'm afraid neither one really shares my fascination with these things." So I love that. It tells us that, yes, there was an audience out there besides the folks that were being marketed to in the pages of game magazines, right? So how many people read these things? That's often very hard to say. In some cases, we do get zines that publish their readers lists. You can see this comes from a fanzine called Fanzine. In other cases, we have folks who were interviewed and they would say, well, I've just published 110 copies of my last zine. But I think 100 is probably, 100 and fewer is probably fairly typical. And this is a map of the locations that are known to me as of this presentation. So I'm aware of at least 355 uniquely named fanzines. Most are, not surprisingly, from the United States. But in this case, they stretch from Nova Scotia all the way over to Honolulu. And I'm aware of some that are international, right? So we've got at least 4 from Canada, 6 from the United Kingdom, 1 from France, 1 from Germany, 1 from Australia. This list is emphatically not definitive, right? This grows every time I go on Twitter. I feel like I meet someone else. So, and I guess this is a good time as any to say, like, I need your help. If you know of folks who are doing this, or if you are one of these folks yourself, you should definitely come and talk to me, okay? But here's the map. We can imagine sort of at the height of fanzines, around 1997, that maybe it looked something like this. If we imagine the word if we imagine this map depopulated, then we kind of arrive at the end of fandom and what happened. Like what happened to this thriving scene, this network of print media being circulated through the Post? Probably not hard to guess, right? There's your culprit. So this is probably a bit reductive to say, right? There are many reasons that fandom quieted down, at least in its print form, but by and large, the internet begins to go into the American household, right? And web publishing tools get easier to use, and people begin to move online, right? So in some ways, this project is actually the story of fandom's migration from print spaces, analog spaces, onto the web, for good and ill. Those who stuck to zines long after this did so for various reasons. One zinester told me, most people by 1999 were smart enough to have learned HTML and start a website. That was not me. I loved gaming mags too much. And so for many, it was kind of an emotional connection that kept them doing this long after their friends had moved online. In talking to the games journalist, Chris, I'm trying to pronounce his name, Bieniek, he used to edit Tips and Tricks, and he kind of carried on the cat's tradition of talking about fanzines. In interviewing him, he told me that he really didn't keep up with the fan scene as it moved online. I think this is an important quote. He says, "It felt like the spirit of the thing didn't carry over. It may have been just my imagination, but I felt like they were quick to shed the punk trappings of the fanzine scene because they saw the online world as a way to jump in front of everybody and become the new pros, the new mainstream." And that spirit of the thing, the punk trappings, that part of the quote in particular jives with an early study of zinesters from 2004, which the scholar Jennifer Rausch discovered that the self-publishers with whom she spoke quote, perceived the internet as a socially deficient means of distribution compared to their established practices of physically handing out, mailing, and exchanging their creations. And I think that phrase, socially deficient, is interesting because, as we've seen, unfortunately, the web has become increasingly socially deficient in other and really toxic ways, right? So why make a fanzine? Well, we've talked a lot about that. I think it's also good to talk about why I'm doing this. So let me go back a little bit, actually, because I like this. There's a quote by Andy Zeisler. You might know her as one of the principals behind Bitch magazine, which started as a zine, actually. She writes, "It can be difficult to talk today about the impact of the medium without giving a whiff of the Luddite, or worse, the wistful old-timer who would prefer to dwell in the rosy glow of the past rather than sharpen up and get with the program." So I hope I haven't come off that way, but if I have, I'm going to exonerate myself presently. So why make a fanzine at the time, right? That is fairly easy to address, right? This was a time when it was much harder to meet like-minded others. This again is Eric Longdon. He writes, "There is nothing like knowing people care that you made it, a fanzine, that you wrote it, you listen to what you are saying. It's a way to communicate with people whom you may never get the chance to see and be listened to otherwise, to meet new people with similar thoughts, ideas, and interests as yourself, to be part of an organization and have friends to talk to, share ideas and thoughts with." So I think it's really important to emphasize how hard it was to do this at the time, and also how scarce information was compared to today, right? It was much harder to discover new things about your interests. It was a kind of a social media before social media, right? But fanzines matter to me, and they matter to historians, I think, first as primary sources, right? That's fairly straightforward, I guess, but I don't know of many better ways to kind of discover what fans were thinking about the games that they played, or the culture around those games, right? These are a record of what everyday players were thinking and discussing before the internet, before the stuff came online. So if you want to know how players were reacting to the 1993 congressional hearings on video game violence, this is a really good way to learn about that. It's all through there, right? So this is a really, really important source of player testimony, how people lived with games, thought about games, and experienced them in the context of their own lives. I like this quote a lot. It sort of gets right to the heart of that. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to read quickly. "Zines are tangible. They're material. The writing is contained in an object that physically ages. Ink fades, paper yellows. Holding a zine from even 10 years ago feels like holding an historical document. Words appearing on a computer screen, even if they are date stamped, seem the opposite. Decontextualized, ahistorical, and temporal." So print is durable. Print lasts. That's why I'm able to do the work I'm doing, because it was donated to an archive. Did I mention I'm a librarian? Here's the other thing that I think is really powerful about this, and this goes back to the hand coloring that we discussed a little bit. So zines helped their authors create a much more humane social network before social media existed. So this is what the zine scholar Alison Pittmeyer called an embodied community. What she means by that is really contained inside this quote, that she considers zines the hub of the gift culture in contrast to a market-based one, right? She argues that zines' materiality helps form a particular kind of connection between their readers and creators, what she calls embodied community. Pleasure plays a key role in creating embodied community. Pleasure is the heart of the zine endeavor, motivating the creation of zines, connecting zine writers and readers, and making even bad zines worth reading. So embodied community here is a kind of back formation of disembodied. So what she's talking about there is the disembodied format of electronic media, right? Where it is really, really easy to be cruel. I think everyone in here knows enough about that, right? It's harder to do that with a print media like zines. If it's really hard to do it in person, right, you're not going to, we hope you wouldn't engage in a certain way with an interlocutor because the body humanizes them. Zines are sort of similar to that. We can sort of get a sense of the person at the other end of the communication because they often include traces of themselves. Sometimes that could be like a coffee stain. Other times it's handwriting. People would personalize these zines or color them in different ways or staple things to them. They include all kinds of things that give a hint of themselves, right, beyond as fanzine readers. Plus, I will just add that as a species of slow media, zines dramatically raise the level of effort required to be a dick. If you want to be a jerk, like, you really have to rise to the occasion, and most people temper themselves and they engage much more thoughtfully, and I think it's really important that we return to that kind of engagement. Fanzines also matter as evocative objects. So if you were in Carly's talk yesterday, you heard her mention this. It's a phrase coined by Sherry Turkle. Evocative objects are things that we think with. They are sort of external expressions of our interiority. So their very thingness, their materiality matters. Objects bring together the way we think and the way we feel. Right? So the true power, this is Lambros Malforos. He's an archaeologist who studies the way that the material things that we make actually impact our cognition. He writes, the true power of everyday objects and things lies in their ability to become our emotional companions as much as they become intellectual anchors. When we set things down in material form, a specific location for remembrance, we transform an internal, invisible, cognitive happening, thought, into an external perceptual event, making objects powerful emotional anchors and economy of memory. So this is really important because the signs of things that we love, the objects that we collect and so forth, they actually help to organize our consciousness, right? Those signs are sort of inseparable from like who we are. So we actually think with things. What I mean is maybe captured in this quote that there are no people in the abstract. People are what they attend to, what they cherish and use. We are sort of familiar with another way to put this. Marshall McLuhan said, medium is the message, right? So in this context, what that means is that writing zines and reading zines, that creates a totally different kind of cognition than another kind of writing, right? Not better or worse, just different. It creates different kinds of associations between you and the reader. It creates different emotions, different memories. So I think it's really important that we continue to think about zines in the context of games because they're going to create a different kind of game knowledge than another kind of writing would, or a digital kind of writing would. As often happens with talks like this, the real world intrudes quite helpfully. Who knows what's going on with Tumblr right now? Let me hear it for the female presenting nipple. What? Okay, so yeah, Tumblr, as that, well, tumbles, sort of reminds us, I hope, reminds me that we really need to think not only about what we write and the way that what we write is preserved and controlled, but also the way that our spaces are preserved and controlled, and who has access to those spaces, and what kind of control we give our readers, and so forth. And this is a reminder that platform holders and owners like Tumblr, they don't really care about us, right? They will chase us off their communities as soon as it doesn't suit their bottom line anymore, right? And we know this because it's happened before. Who used to do LiveJournal, right? And then there was this exodus, right, when LiveJournal began to clamp down on certain kinds of expression, and so we all came to Tumblr, and now Tumblr is like, we're sort of through with you. So we're really lucky that we do have some organizations like the Organization for Transformative Works, which runs the archive of our own, AO3, we hear what? Yeah, all right. So this is happening in digital spaces, which I'm really grateful to say. But there's no reason that we can't do this offline as well, and that we can't be equally intentional in what we choose to publish, where, for what reasons, and for what readers. And I think zines can be a really important way to do that. And it's not just me sort of making that appeal. This is actually happening. Here are just two species that I managed to pluck off the web. This is a fanzine called Hyperplay RPG. It's coming out of the United Kingdom. Its aim is to sort of pick up where Superplay left off. True to its name, it's quite RPG-centric, but it is unmistakably a fanzine. Many of you in here probably know of Jonathan Kim at Lab Zero Games. This is just a tweet that went out New Year's Day. It says, looking back in 2018, I contributed to a lot of zines, and he names 3 here. I don't know what these zines are. They might be very different from the things I talked about, but this is happening right now. People are still sort of creating this media for themselves, right? So, in conclusion, here's another cartoon that I plucked out of On Parade. And here you've got Pac-Man. It's kind of coming off the screen, is chasing poor Ziggy. But what I love about this is that it works for me as a kind of metaphor, right? When we play games, we bring all of ourselves to them, right? We bring our background, which includes our dispositions, our inclinations, our education, our memories, our lived experience. We bring that to the game, and that changes the experience, right? So that your experience of Outrun or whatever is different than mine. It has to be. But I want to know, how is it for you, right? And I think zines are a really great way to express that, right? So I'd like to see more of our digital experiences come off the screen like that into our real world, into our material world. Thank you so much. Yes, so I think you had first dibs on the question about copyright, and I think that is an awesome question because the easiest way to say that is that basically fanzine creators sort of thumb their nose at copyright, right? They're not really doing obeisance to it.
Well, it's not so much that, you know, the people can redraw things. It's like, how do they get their stuff published? They do it themselves.
They do it themselves, that's right.
Like they print it out as, I don't know, Office Depot and Xerox.
Yeah, exactly. These folks were well acquainted with the staff at Kinko's, or Office Max or Office Depot, what have you. Yeah, they would create the stuff. In some cases, there are zines that are hand lettered, which is absolutely incredible. You had to have like a graphomania to do that, I think. But there are some fanzines that are hand lettered. There are some that are done on typewriters. By this time, around 1990 to 1995, desktop publishing was easier to obtain, and so people are creating these in, I guess, what we now think of as pretty primitive publishing programs. But they were able to create layouts, magazine-style layouts, create a master copy, and then run off 50 copies at Kinko's.
Could you talk a little bit about your work? Like, why did you get into fanzines, and like, what were you hoping to get out when you went to the Strong, and what you actually left with? I mean, you've done a lot of describing them, but I'm curious, like, why are you doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I applied to work at the Strong and submitted my fellowship application, it was speculative, right? I had no idea what to expect when I found these things because, in large part, they are not available online, and that's for a variety of reasons, right? Some of them are important. These are the creations of kids in large part. They're teenagers. They publish their parents' addresses. Many of their parents still live at these places, so they don't want to put the stuff online. They do sometimes have attitudes and jokes and so forth that I'm sure they may not want to be associated with today. So there are some interesting ethical considerations in using this. That's all a way of saying, like, I had no idea what to expect. I had certain things that I'd hoped to find in them. I really was hoping to find another side of the video game player, like, where were the other players at this time? Where are the women, right? Where are the people of color? So far I haven't found as much of that as I had hoped to, but I have found this instead. And I guess the way of directly addressing your question is that I'm interested in democratic media generally. I'm interested in doing more for ourselves at a time when the web in particular is more and more sort of monopolized by big interests, and blogs have sort of gone by the wayside. I'm interested in returning ourselves to these conversations and finding places where we can sort of talk about the things that matter to us. So I guess I'm just interested in yeah, do-it-yourself media and people's media generally. Yeah, I think you were first.
A quick question about Strong Institute. Are you really just collecting more of like the scholarly aspect, or are you interested in collecting the more magazine, like just pretty content essentially? Like, are you guys collecting news kind of thing?
So that's a great question for my colleagues at the Strong. So I'm actually not associated with the Strong. I just gratefully took their money and then flew up to Rochester and spent 2 weeks with them. I work at a small liberal arts university in San Antonio called Trinity, where I sort of wear, now it's 3 hats, but a librarian hat and a professor hat. So yeah, I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you about that after the panel. Yeah.
So did it seem like these zines, these fanzines, were in dialogue with other zine communities, or were they more part of like the video game community?
I love that question. So the question is, were video game fanzines in dialogue with other zines? And it depends, right? And I guess that's also a way of talking about the fact that zines just come and go like immediately. They just sometimes evaporate. There's like one issue and then it's just gone forever. The longer running zines, eventually the people who are most interested in this, they begin to connect with other parts of this community as their interests deepen, or I guess widen is the better way to say that. In some cases, they begin to get a little less interested in video games, a little more interested in music or politics, and you begin to see that in their video game fanzine. Suddenly there's a column that's like, I want to talk about the Clinton administration. I want to talk about abortion, comes up in one of them. And I think a really great way to see that is actually looking at the Chris Kohler collection over the Strong, because in addition to all these video game fanzines, and then some of the kinds that we might expect, right, like there are anime zines and so forth, he has zines. He has a zine called Revolution Calling, which is political, as you might guess. It's sort of very left-wing, maybe kind of like an anarchist publication. He also has issues of just a personal zine by a high school girl, and several issues of this, because she happened to live in the same city that he lived in. So yeah, there are people that begin to make forays into the wider culture of what are called per-zines or personal zines. It's a great question. Yeah?
So you mentioned earlier that a lot of zines could be defined by their author, but do you ever see specific specialization, such as like a controller-based magazine or a magazine about game music, when finding these old retro zines?
Yeah, that is also a great question. So the question is, what kind of specialization existed in this culture or subculture? And what you begin to see is a lot of specialization by console type, as we might imagine. I think the more interesting examples of that are the people who want to talk about what even then were retro consoles, right? So they're interested in recovering gaming history at a time when it was like spectacularly uncool to do that. And weirdly, they suffered a lot of backlash for that. They got letters from other people like, why aren't you talking about Sega? So, you know, we're sort of grateful to them for persisting and saying like, no, these are the games that I grew up with and they're important, damn it. So you do have a lot of specialization like that. I haven't found any of the really particular stuff like the kind that you mentioned, although those sort of articles do turn up within those pages. And unfortunately, I think we're at time, but I'm happy to answer any and all questions you might have afterwards. So thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.